Welcome everyone to a City Council study session on October 7th. It's 6 p.m. and we just have one council member. Cheryl Wink is missing tonight because she had to work, I think she's out of town, and I think she announced that a couple weeks ago. So we begin tonight with one agenda item, and it's the City Center Redevelopment information, and our Redevelopment Manager Dan Poremba is here to present an update to us.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, council members. This is the latest update on City Center redevelopment efforts, and specifically the ongoing process to identify and recommend to council a preferred master developer for the city to partner with in redeveloping the city property here at City Center. And as you'll remember from prior discussions, we've called out the city property in blue on this site plan. It's adjacent to what we have referred to in red as the C3 property. And you'll remember that we've been exploring the redevelopment as really initiated because of the foreclosure on the C3 property last year, in August of last year, by C3 Asset Management, a special servicer. This is the former property, or the property that was formerly developed and operated by Weingarten Realty. So with council's consent in March of this year, we initiated a master developer procurement process. It included a widely publicized request for qualifications that went national, and then this was followed by a request for proposals that was issued to 3 highly qualified development firms that had responded to the RFP. And then following a multi-department evaluation of the RFP submittals, 2 master developers were identified and interviewed by staff, and that interview included the then acting interim city manager, as well as the directors of community development, public works, finance, and myself. And the 2 developer finalists who were identified at that point, and we discussed this in July as well, were SKB of Portland, Oregon. They're also known as Scanlon Kemper Bard, and the firm of Brinkman of Fort Collins, Colorado. And we were really very, very pleased, and I think most people in the community, the real estate community, were notably somewhat surprised that we had 2 very high quality, successful real estate firms, and that they had specific experience working with local municipalities on mixed use and transit oriented developments. And the only reason I say surprised is because typically the developers are so engaged these days in multiple project endeavors that the thought process is that working with a municipality on a kind of a complex public-private partnership would be at the bottom of their list and things that they would want to do on a current basis. Since that selection process, then we updated council mid-July, July 15th, and then continued to vet the 2 developer finalists. And that vetting process included a follow-up detailed discussion of 26 supplemental questions. Those are attached to your council packet. And the representatives of the city in those interview-styled meetings included the city manager for portions of each meeting, the director of community development, myself, and a representative from Stray Advisors. Stray Advisors is a firm that specifically specializes in helping municipalities structure public-private partnerships and master development agreements. Their current work for the city of Denver includes the National Western Stock Show redevelopment, as well as the planned redevelopment of the Denver Performing Arts Center. And they work very closely with our outside counsel on city center matters. So last time, I think we also discussed the fact that, and we've discussed it in multiple meetings, that staff has communicated extensively with C3 over the past year about the potential benefits of having their contract purchaser for the C3 property be the same as the city's selected master developer for the city property. And we were actually at that time heading towards that possibility. C3 was actually negotiating with one of the two master developer finalists that we had identified and had been moving through the vetting process. Unfortunately, they were not able to come to terms, and on September 14th, C3 informed the city that their decision, and it was largely at the insistence of their bondholders, was to take their property off of the market for the balance of the year. They believe that with some additional leasing activity, which they've had over the course of the summer, that they could take the property back to market early in 2020 and achieve a higher price. We have continued to communicate with them about the fact that City Council might be less motivated to discuss amendments and extensions on the C3 property ground lease at that later date versus continuing to collaborate now. Unfortunately, the way this financing is set up, the actual debtors or bondholders are represented by this entity, and they have their own opinions, and C3 was actually not able to persuade the bondholders about the value of collaborating with the city on a current basis. So we're back in a position of having to wait for them to bring the C3 property to market. Meanwhile, based on our communications with both of the master developer finalists, both of them had confirmed to us from the very beginning that they felt that the city property was wholly developable and very developable on its own. There's plenty of acreage there. It has a high level of visibility, and there's a lot of creativity in terms of the financial structuring that could be done with the city in terms of what a master development agreement would look like. So I think our recommendation to council at this point is that we continue with that procurement process. We think that a slight amount of additional time will be necessary to bring back to you a well-developed recommendation, probably in late November. With that recommendation will also come a recommendation for your interview and discussion with the recommended developer. But we remain very, very encouraged to have two high-quality developers that are interested in this role. And I think our plan is to take advantage of this slight additional amount of time to do two things. One is we're jumping into some further negotiation or exploration, more accurately I should say, with RTD about the 910 shared parking spaces that we're contracted to provide to RTD here at City Center. And we think that with some clarification about that obligation, that'll help our discussions with both of the master developers. The other thing we intend to do is continue to work with outside counsel and with Stray advisors to bring along a deal structure outline so that when we come back to you in November, we can give you a general overview of what a financial transaction with a master developer might look like. And I think that then would guide your interview and your discussions with the recommended developer. Just by way of review, we covered this a little bit, but I think it's important to remember that this involves a series of agreements between the city and the developer, if that's the direction council elects to go. So following the discussion and the recommendation of the developer in November, typically the next step is the negotiation of what's called an exclusive negotiating agreement. That really then guides the city and the developer towards the negotiation of a pre-development agreement, and that would probably take an additional period of 60 to 90 days. The pre-development agreement then defines the overall process by which both parties would work on an overall redevelopment plan and ultimate development agreement. And the working on the redevelopment plan would involve an extensive amount of community outreach and input, and both developers are highly aware of how critical that is to Inglewood. They both committed to that. That was one of the selection criteria that we had identified in both the RFQ and the RFP. So I think we're on the same page with both developers in terms of their expectations about that. This current step, heading towards the recommendation to council and then the subsequent negotiation of the exclusive negotiating agreement, does not result in any current cost to the city, but we think continues to allow the city to protect its various property interests in City Center and to really leverage those interests, as we've discussed before, to create some specific monetary cash flows to the city. So I think with that background, I'd be happy to take any questions and provide any additional detail.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Berentine.
I looked the wrong thing first. Thank you, Mayor. The entire purpose of going ahead and trying to work with a master developer was to go ahead and have some consistency in design and working with them on both properties, because the ones that are in blue we don't own yet. Those properties we don't have ownership of yet. The Inglewood Environmental Foundation still owes them, and there's still a debt on there. So the entire purpose of doing this was to go ahead and make sure that we leveraged some of the ground lease to try and have some consistency in the development and continuity with what we were going to be doing, so we could all work together. And now I'm concerned because we're making the comment that we can just move forward on our own with this, and that doesn't take care of the original stated purpose, which was to work with the developer and with C3 and make sure that we had that development continuity and consistency. So what would be the problem with us just waiting a couple of months if they believe they're going to bring that in and at the beginning of the year? And the second thing is, you've already identified that there would be some benefit at this point now for us waiting, because we might be able to negotiate with RTD, not only for the spaces that we have on the site, but for the additional 428 or 450 spaces that they still owe us for the 3 different elections where they've gotten more money and kept promising us that we were going to get that. So wouldn't we benefit from just going ahead and waiting, seeing what C3 does, who they end up getting, whether they're able to work with the people that we're at least talking to, and then have some more conversations with RTD, and then maybe see when we're going to actually own the property?
I would say there's several answers to that, one of which is that when we first started talking about this, we said that in a perfect world it would really be great to knit those 2 properties together, and that would be one of the things that we would try to achieve. It's still possible that we can get there. I think we said that the primary purpose for exploring the redevelopment of the city property was really to exert influence on the buyer of the C3 property, and that's still the case. I think it's still important to proceed with the developer selection on the city property, because that will ultimately still give us the maximum amount of involvement with the C3 property, both in terms of working with C3 as well as in establishing the expectations with the contract buyer of that property. We've also said that it's the best way to really preserve the city's, protect the city's interests and maximize the city's property values in its own property, as well as the underlying ground lease. We also had mentioned the fact that we are in a timing crunch, if you will, as the current real estate expansion ultimately is coming closer to an end. Whenever that is, we have a nice opportunity to leverage the national focus on the Denver area, and we think we should do that now rather than waiting for the next expansion. And probably more than anything, I think we laid the groundwork that we are dealing with a situation where City Center is a fading first-generation transit-oriented development that is suffering now from a lack of walkability, lack of some uses such as hotel that we think we can get incorporated now. It has definitely an overemphasis on dated big box retail formats, a sea of surface parking, and underdevelopment of the uses and activities needed to support successful, sustainable project. So even without the C3 connection, as nice as that would be, I mean, we have plenty of city interest to protect on the C3 property. And again, it's I think it's always relevant that right now the city is not generating any revenues from that valuable land holding.
Excuse me, Councilmember Barentine, he was answering you. Are you listening? I just want to make sure that he's trying to give you an answer, and I've seen you've not really been looking at him for the last 4 or 5 minutes, and I'm just wondering. Excellent. Excellent. Do you want to respond?
No, I think that takes care of it. There were probably really about 4 or 5 reasons that we laid that groundwork early on and then in subsequent briefings with council. So I think it's not all dependent on what C3 does, and they're very, as we've talked about along the way, undependable, if you will. So we really need to carve our own path and kind of use that to continue to influence what they do.
Thank you. Councilmember Sierra?
Thank you, Mayor. Can we talk about the timing of these next steps?
Sure.
You laid out 5. So the way that I understood it is that there's five next steps in a sense, right? The first is we're going to select a master developer. Second step is then negotiate the exclusive negotiation agreement, followed by the pre-development agreement, then the redevelopment agreement, and then finally the development agreement. So starting with the master developer, when do we expect for that to happen? And then if we have an idea of, time between each of those next steps, I would appreciate it.
I think in rough terms, our hope is to provide you with a master developer recommendation in late November. Then depending on on council's schedule to see when we can set up for you to conduct a fairly detailed interview and receive a presentation from that master developer. I'd like to hope that would be in December, but of course that's dependent on your schedule. With your consent following that interview, then the process of moving to an exclusive negotiation agreement is probably 60 to 90 days to get to the exclusive negotiating agreement. Then there's an additional 60 to 90 days from there to get to a pre-development agreement, and probably the period of time following that to get to the final master development agreement and underlying redevelopment plan is probably 6 to 8 months. So we're, in terms of total time period, to have a master developer on board and to have that redevelopment plan also agreed to between the developer and council is we're probably looking at late summer or early third quarter of 2020. And I'd like to also just qualify that by saying if there's a specific project that they can move forward on quickly, we should at least be open to that possibility. The developers have focused on, one of the developers at least has put us in touch with one of the major hotel companies who's very interested in the site as a hotel. And if we could find a way to go vertical with a hotel early on, I think we'd at least like to preserve that as a possibility. Thank you.
Councilmember Cuesta?
Thank you, Mayor. To the note that you had regarding C3, and on September 4th, we were unexpectedly notified that they were pulling the property and that they're hoping that they can generate higher sale by remarketing in 2020 based on some continued leasing opportunities. So to those leasing opportunities, it sounds like they just re-extended a tenant to a longer lease. Do you know if that's what they're looking to do? Are they looking to fill more tenants, or are they just looking to extend current tenants?
I would say both. So what happened in that period, really, while we were discussing it midsummer, and then September 4th is they had some success in some of their leasing efforts, and also a couple of larger tenants had reached out to them and indicated that they would be interested in negotiating extensions of their leases.
I see, and then that makes me wonder, how much are they looking into redevelopment if they're signing long-term tenants? I mean, that would make me think that it's not in the immediate plans, would be my thought.
I think that's correct. The reality is, to the extent that they extend and sign up new leases, that does create more of a kind of a status quo situation rather than a redevelopment situation. And so that was one of the things that we were really trying to persuade them on, was the value of collaborating on a redevelopment scenario where the city, what we could bring to the table as an amendment and an extension of the underlying ground lease with certain conditions to it that would give the city greater control and greater say over the future of that property. Now, to a certain extent, we're a little bit at their will in terms of how they redevelop. But the reality is that releasing authority was entirely consistent with the original underlying ground lease. So there's nothing that they're doing that was out of bounds with what was originally anticipated in the ground lease.
Thank you. And it also said they're looking to remarket in 2020. Now, that could be January, that could be December. Do you have any feeling on when that would take place? Is that expected early in the year, mid-year, late year?
They've told us that they would expect it to be the first quarter.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor?
Yeah, Mr. Bowers.
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. I just wanted to add one thing that C3 brought up in relation to their timing, which is they indicated to us that there may have been a recent new appraisal on the site that had a different value that was increased over what they were negotiating with the selected buyer. And so that might have entered into the equation as well. The one thing I would say about extending the retail leases, it's one thing to have these tenants exercise options, and we think that's what they've done, is they've exercised their next option in their lease. A lot of those retail formats are changing very rapidly, and there are more of those types of stores closing than there are opening. So there's a decent potential here that in the next several years, despite those options of extending the leases, those stores may be vacating this area just based on market conditions and the shifts in the market. So I think that's one of the things that we should keep in mind in here, is to look at the long term, because the one tenant and the one issue is not going, or the one factor that's not going away on the site is the city's role long term. And so the long term view belongs to the city of Englewood. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do here in terms of preserve those opportunities on the C3 site, but move forward on the other site and to co-plan them as best we can, but understanding from the very get-go, this was going to be a phased redevelopment. It was very unlikely, and I've said this before, that a developer would come in and essentially replicate what happened 20 years ago. I think that was pretty rare then. It's even more rare now that these types of things happen and get built all at once. So phasing was always in the plan, and this is something I think we can definitely factor and plan around as well.
Mayor, just as it relates to Councilman Cuesta's question, I just mentioned that all of this leasing activity and discussion that C3 is having is not negative. They brought in one tenant, Colorado Retina, a very specialized medical tenant into the retail along Englewood Parkway here, and they're negotiating with some other medical tenants in there, and we think that that's extremely favorable because it's suggesting that the healthcare cluster, if you will, economic cluster, is going to continue to be a viable base for City Center. So that's really a positive. So some of their activity will only enhance the value of the city property and what could be done with it potentially.
Finished. Thank you. I think it's Mayor Pro Tem Russell next.
Thank you. Is this the first time you've presented this information, or did you present the same information to the chamber, or have you presented this information to other groups other than City Council?
Nothing as detailed as this. We've provided a kind of a general update to the chamber that was really, in essence, a summary of some of our past conversations with council. But we didn't go into any of the detail about the vetting process or the supplemental questions that, or the review process.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Martinez.
Thank you, Mayor. Can you remind me, how does RTD factor into all of this? And at what point do we need to kind of really talk with them?
We have, the city and RTD have an intergovernmental agreement and a related easement across the property that obligates the city to provide RTD 910 shared parking spaces, both in the structured parking that's connected to this building and in the north parking lot. So, you know, that obligation has to be defined as it relates to the redevelopment potential of the property. The good news, and we hope to kind of ferret this out and continue in discussions with RTD, is that is shared parking, and it gives the city the opportunity, the right, if you will, to add other uses, particularly if those uses drive parking needs that are not the same time as the RTD patrons. So to the extent that the highest demand uses, it looks like for the Civic Center parcel are employee parking in this building during the day, hotel parking at night, and then multifamily residential. We are really dealing with off-hour parking that's the exact opposite of the time that the RTD parking is needed. So we think even under the current agreements, starting with the Civic Center parcel, that we can probably get to a nice working agreement about how the current shared parking obligation should be administered. Then over time, we'd eventually have further detailed discussion about the parking on the north parking lot. That lot, if you'll remember, is currently ground leased by the city itself, from a trust, and we pay annual ground rent on that. And the early indication is that a developer that we select ought to be able to buy out that ground lease on a favorable basis, and then incorporate the RTD shared parking in the development on that lot. We hope ultimately we might be able to get some reduction in parking from RTD and or an agreement to move some of that parking around. But I think even without that, that north parking lot is developable for other uses.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a few questions and come back to Councilmember Barentine. So if they're seeing greater value of the property in C3 that they have, do you think that's going to be true for our property too, or have we taken a look at any change in our valuation?
Well, our property, you know, because it's closer to the station and is true TOD property, I would say has, you know, is very enhanced in terms of its value. The fact that this building is here and has renovation potential, the fact that there's a parking structure that can be shared for other uses. So, you know, from a redevelopment perspective, our property has great value and more flexibility because it's not burdened with those retail leases.
Right, and we know what the current value we think it is.
We are working with Stray on trying to create a financial matrix of all the pluses and negatives, if you will, and then we're going to look at the appraised value applied to that so that we can start to, from the city's perspective, develop our own ideas about value without having to be dependent on developers to necessarily tell us what they think it's worth.
So part of this process is figuring out what our real current assessment is so that we're in the market for what it really is worth as well.
Absolutely. And then we want to use that to be able to give council a variety of alternatives in terms of how the overall master development agreement could be structured.
Great. With RTD, I think the original agreement was to use that north property that we've kept as green space, and that was very contentious. So what you're talking about is that being maintained and finding other ways to meet the demand for parking, or did I hear you say developing that north parcel?
No,
in a
I'm
way?
not, we're not taking that at all into consideration. I could see some scenarios down the road where it might come back into the discussion, but that's based on my understanding of the history of that. That's not assumed at all. We're generally assuming some possible reduction of the 600 plus spaces on that north lot, and then incorporation of those spaces into the parking structures below what would be developed on that lot.
Okay, great, thank you. Councilmember Berentine.
I'd like a clarification of your question, Mayor, if I could please. Were you talking about the covering up and doing a culvert kind of thing over at the park?
I was talking about that triangle piece that we had, that large public outcry, and duly, I think was the right thing, that we didn't give that up it's riparian landscaping along the river there that's to the north that I think was always intended, or someone thought that was where we were going to put the other, how many spaces?
There was actually
still-
and it's north of that Lot A, as
Yeah.
it's labeled up there. Unfortunately, didn't cover that in the site plan. But there was extensive discussion in the past about putting as many as 500 cars onto that.
Yeah. I thought it was 300 and something, but 500 makes me even more nervous. But yes, that was the parcel I thought I heard him talking about that parcel, but that wasn't what you were talking about.
No,
You're
we're-
talking about the north on the other.
Correct, just parcel A, not anything north of
Okay,
that.
great. I just was clarifying that.
Because that would be a separate discussion, because I don't think we own that property. That was already being kind of done, and that was a whole different ball of wax. I don't think that's part of any of this piece of it.
Okay.
But if it becomes that, then I would have to have that discussion. The first question is that you said that you want a reduction in the parking from RTD. I don't know what you mean by that. That the parking that was originally promised us from RTD in order to do the transit-oriented district, that we would want that reduced?
I think there's a basis for having a discussion with RTD that 910 spaces could be reduced, because the catchment area for this shared parking with RTD extends way beyond Inglewood. And as parking has been added to the system, there's a continuing kind of fairness question about should Inglewood be burdened with system parking that's so extensive. I mean, 910 spots is a lot of parking, and it gets in the way in some regards to what the city can do with its own property interests at City Center. So yeah, we'd like to have a discussion with them about some modest reduction in that total, but I don't think the redevelopment plan would be actually contingent on them saying yes to that.
The reduction in parking would be on us because it was a benefit to us. It was what was promised us from RTD, not a burden to us, but that we wouldn't have parking going into the community. So I think that would be a separate conversation, but I am intrigued by the way that that's being presented as if it would be a burden to us and that RTD would be relieving us of the parking that they promised us. So I guess that would go with another study on how much parking and whether it actually has been relieved by other lines, because the neighborhoods right now don't believe that it's been relieved. We have a lot of parking that's been pushed into the community that's kind of upsetting, but I like the way it's being phrased there, but I would have to respectfully disagree that it's not the burden on us to have that parking. It was the promise from RTD for our community. And the other was the presentations that you made, who did you make presentations to on this? I've heard some comments being made, and I just wondered which presentations did you make? Did you make one to the chamber on this?
Yeah, we made a general presentation to the chamber.
Who else?
And it was a business with breakfast event a couple of weeks ago. We made, at the request of council, we've made some related presentations to Keep Inglewood Beautiful, planning and zoning. I think that's primarily it, just to try and provide an ongoing general update about the activity.
And then along with you made a presentation at a town hall for a council member, and generally in those presentations, because the entire thing that you gave to us was probably about 10 minutes, so it would seem that you gave pretty much the same presentation then to all of those organizations. And was it pretty much similar information to what you'd presented to us in that 10 minutes, including all of the vetting and the information with C3? It seemed pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I would say the only thing at council's direction, we've included additional information about the initial efforts and ideas regarding a downtown development authority, what would be ahead on that, and then also provided some background information on this Dr. Cog grant that we were able to secure, and that will be coming back to council on the grant agreement, and then the selection of the consultants to perform those tasks. So we provided some general information on that.
Okay. I understand the Mayor Pro Tem's concern, because when we have people coming from the boards and commissions or from a town hall meeting, and it's prior to us getting the information, it does kind of make it a little difficult at times, but I appreciate that it's pretty consistent with what we heard tonight.
Yeah, actually, everything I think we presented to any group has already been presented and discussed with council.
Thank you. Appreciate that clarification. So the RTD thing is a really interesting thing. I do think there's a connection here, and I can see why you would say it's a burden, because we had to give them the land for them to then develop it. So we have to figure out where the land's going to come from, unless they condemn land somewhere that they don't just have land out of the blue. So or they have to build a garage, which they never were able to. They can't do that. They don't have the amount of money they have is not going to do that.
Yeah, I would say that kind of the simple answer is that the value to the city of what we can develop on land that's currently required for the shared parking is much, much more valuable than the parking.
Garage.
All right. So we have to find a way to either move that parking around, reduce it, and or build on top of it. And it's probably going to be some combination of all of those.
And maybe a follow-up question that would be, and this could be a council request, would be, have we done a survey of the neighborhood over there recently? And Councilmember Sierra, you might know better on what the pressures have continued to be for parking along residences there. I don't know if they have parking things in their cars now that they're using to limit or anything like that, but it would be nice to know what the update is for whether the pressures are heavy or not.
We can typically get that information from RTD, which does track their utilization of these lots. And
Well, I'm thinking of the private streets
Okay.
and in front of people's homes and just along the private streets where I think people were complaining over the years. That would be just to have a survey of, are people parking there all day long that are not in the lot but out in the neighborhoods? So, is yours on? Okay, that's really hard to see.
It's been on for a while.
But hers is really bright, so
Right.
it's shouting out at me. I don't know which of you was first, so, okay, great.
So regarding that question, there are parking concerns. There's actually been concerns from neighbors that Cushing Park is being used for RTD parking. So I think I did raise that with the city manager about a week or so ago. Secondly, I guess going back to the issue or the study session that we had a couple months back where we talked about the RFPs, and we went through a little bit of the information. The RFPs that were presented, they did only base it off the city of Inglewood property, correct?
Correct. We did have them identify, we had them address, if you will, the C3 property and their potential interest in acquiring that. And one of our two developer finalists was in the running. I think they actually continue to be interested, and one of the reasons to actually go ahead with the process is if they were selected, it's probably the best way to have that developer come back in and become the acquirer of the C3 property.
So then in terms of the timing that you outlined earlier with the next 5 steps, you know, obviously if we were to choose a master developer within the next, sounded like 3 months, by the end of November, you were hoping to present a master developer to us, we would interview them, then make a determination. Around that timing, that's when potentially the C3 property is going to go back on the market.
Correct.
So the master developer that's chosen can still utilize the city of Inglewood as the scope of the project, but then obviously one of the two was interested in developing the C3 property. I'm just trying to figure out, you know, not necessarily that the fact that we have to wait, but what is the deadline for the master developer to figure out exactly whether or not the C3 property is going to be part of this, is not part of this? How does that change things overall for either of the two that if they wanted to move forward?
I think the answer is that both developers one has said that they're not interested in the C3 property after taking an extensive look at it. The other one, who's looked at it over a very long period of time, continues to have a level of interest. But at the same time, they are very content with the idea of moving forward on the city property alone, even if the C3 property does not come back to them via, you know, future marketing. So I would say that the critical path is to move forward with selection of the developer on the city property and see what C3 decides to do. I mean, they've been, as we've seen already, unpredictable. And so there's a possibility that even though they tell us, and they've told us inaccurate things before, that even though their intention might be to market it in the first quarter, they could hang on to it for another year.
Right.
So I hope that.
It does answer the question. The other aspect of it, and this is, I'll shut up my mic after this question, but what they presented within the RFP is what is possible within the City of Inglewood properties. Obviously, citizen input hasn't been taken into account, but they're just saying right now within those RFPs, this is what we can see, whether it was residential, hotel, you know, retail on the lower level, that type of thing. This is what they see as possible today with the City of Inglewood property.
That's correct. They had really focused on the city property, and the C3 property was just a possibility, and it was largely one that we had defined through the architectural firm that we used to do some conceptual planning work. That was Tribal Architects.
Mayor Pro Tem Russell.
Thank you. I do have a few concerns in the fact that the developers have agreed to go to the citizens and get citizen feedback, but once we've hired a developer, it is in their best interest to develop this property according to the way they want. I mean, I don't know, is there any way to get public feedback before, during the process of hiring the developer, rather than waiting till after council has hired a developer?
I would say, to address your concerns, a couple possibilities. One is you're going to have a chance to talk to the developer and raise your concerns about that and their commitment to that process before you ever consent to moving forward. The other thing is then there'll be another phase following the exclusive negotiating agreement where you'll be able to see how they're performing in terms of their commitment to that outreach and public input process before council reviews and approves the pre-development agreement. Then there's yet another safeguard, which is you'll be able to see and participate in the underlying redevelopment plan and review and approve the final master development agreement. So you'll generally speaking probably get 3 different go, no-goes with regard to the developer, and you'll be able to really assess how they are, in fact, complying with their obligation to involve the public and get full public input on the redevelopment plan.
Thank you for that. And also, I would like to make sure that we have the parking issue assessed before we move through with anything, because that has been really contentious in that neighborhood over there. I mean, I've had people tell me that they just quit using RTD down here because there was no place to park. So I think that is a huge piece of the puzzle. So thank you.
I also wanted to ask a follow-up to what you just were answering here. I liked the idea proposed of getting a little bit more citizen input. Is there, I mean, I think you all probably know what this site, some of the best and highest uses of this land might be that are being considered, or is there a way to float some of those ideas and get some reactions? I mean, and then secondly, we've done a lot of different studies on our retail and our overcapacity of retail, and sometimes, and I'm wondering how much will they have access to some of those things to help inform what might be a good use of this property? And so that we're not just, you know, some of those things have informed us for some things, but can we help them with that? That's two different questions, I know.
You know, I would say as these things go, probably one of the most efficient ways and effective ways to gather public feedback is to let the public, first of all, there'll probably be some vetting meetings where they get to talk about what they'd like to see. But once you get beyond that, the most effective way is let both council and the public react to what the developer is proposing. You know, because they're going to propose the uses that they think are most viable and work today in light of market conditions. And then council and the public can react to those in terms of whether the right mix in terms of your view of what's needed in the city. And from that is an ongoing refinement of what will then become the underlying redevelopment plan.
Okay. It would just be nice to have a little bit more, I don't know, interaction around it so that they know, at least council really, I mean, I think we all know we want this place to be activated and used well.
Yeah.
Particularly because it's on the light rail, and make use of that so that parking isn't an issue. They can
I
get off the
think-
train, come in here, do something and leave and not have parking.
I think when you see whatever developer is recommended to you, I think the presentation that's envisioned would be a detailed discussion of the uses that they see and generally how they see them put onto the site and in what order. And I think not only that, but you'll see what they've done with other cities and how they've brought multiple uses into, you know, a partnership with a local municipality. And you'll have the opportunity to assess that process.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Barentine and then Councilmember Costa.
For the properties that we have there, the acreage that you have on there, you have one of the 4.1 acres kind of at the top and the 6.5 at the bottom. And the 6.5 at the bottom includes looks like it includes the little storefronts that are along the amphitheater.
The
And then
BB,
I apologize, let me finish my question.
yeah.
So it looks like you're including the amphitheater and the station, all of that is part of the redevelopment. But is it really? I mean, the access to come in for RTD, don't we have to keep some of that roundabout way for their buses and that? How much of that is actually developable that we would be considering to develop of that 12 acres?
I don't think we know the answer today, and we're really, you know, we've said that the heart of the civic center parcel is this building, the parking structure, some of the land between this building and the tracks, but the rest is really public space, and the redevelopment planning will have to take a look at that. We've asked them really to focus on how to activate that space and make that a more sustainable, viable, active public space. But in the course of doing that, if they can also identify a rearrangement of that space that allows some other uses to be put in or around that, we've said that we would collectively take a look at that. We've also told them that we would really like them to acquire, if not through ownership, the right to lease and manage that BB parcel, which I think you're referring to is the retail space across the way here in the first floor level of the Western Art Walk apartment building. That space is
Well,
just,
the BB that you're talking about is in the orange, that's C3.
yes, it is.
Okay. No, I was talking about the blue that's coming off of the amphitheater there above C.
Okay.
Only the blue part is all I was talking about in there. I just was asking how much of those 10 and a half acres there is being given to the developer and we're being told that they have to work with to develop. And you're saying it's all of the blue. That's the short answer to it. It's all of the blue. We're looking for them to give us ideas on how they want to do that. That would include the station, it would include the amphitheater, and it would include the green space that's out here and maybe the fountain, I guess. I don't know. So that when we talk to the public, we know exactly what we're telling them is up for reinvention potentially by a developer here.
I would say we've told them, here's the land that's either owned or controlled by the city or EAF. And, you know, the development land is primarily B and A. But in terms of overall management, activation, programming, we'd like you to really look at the balance of this property too, because it's really a critical part of the reactivation of the entire project. So it's not really redevelopment land per se, but it's land that we would anticipate that they would exercise some management over. And we've even talked about this whole idea that the private sector could eventually completely replace EAF, which is probably what should happen here.
Okay,
All
so
right.
it's accurate to tell them all of what's in the blue.
Yeah,
So,
but
okay.
all I'm cautioning is I wouldn't tell them that all of that blue property is available for development. It's available for programming and marketing and asset management.
So if they ask a question that we might lose the amphitheater, we might lose some of that green space, that might be part of the discussion, so that if they're interested, that they might want to have that, attend and have that conversation if they want to get rid of it, or if they want to see it developed, or if they want to keep it. Just it's all of the blue, so
I
A
wouldn't-
and B.
I don't think that's an accurate statement saying that those public plaza and fountain spaces are open to being reclaimed by the developer. That's not the intention, nor has that been the discussion.
Point of information.
go ahead.
just, on the street there, why
Can
is
you,
this?
can you put your mic up to your mouth?
Why is the street included? Are the retail spaces along the street, is that part of EAF or no?
No, that is the retail and office spaces, the two-story buildings on the south side of Inglewood Parkway are part of the ground lease with EAF, but everything else is not. It's really just the street and the sidewalk and right-of-way areas connected with Inglewood Parkway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Queston, that'll be our last one.
Thank you. Mr. Poremba, I appreciate you outlining the several points in which community engagement will take place. In addition to that, is I think that the community engagement is going to be paramount through the process. In addition to that, is this likely to go through a PUD process? I'm sorry?
Councilmember Costa, this area is is a planned unit development,
Sure.
so it would be an amendment. It would be essentially a major amendment to the PUD, so it would essentially go through all the regular PUD process that would be required of any other project.
Thank you. And that was my understanding too, that if it is currently one, similar to the Hive that we just did,
That's
and then
correct.
that major amendment comes along, it essentially, you go through a very, very similar, if not identical process to what the
Correct.
standard PUD would be. Very good. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you for the information, and keep it coming. I'm glad that we're moving forward on this and continuing to get ready, because there may be more synergies we can't even know what the future brings. But just for everyone to know, I mean, council gets to make the final decisions about this, so we can say no to stuff, but we can keep getting information to figure it out. Thank you very much for the work you've been doing on this. All right, we are adjourned from here and moving into the regular meeting next door. Yes.